They said Dusty Hollow was the sort of place that measured a person by how quickly a gossip could spread their name. The town sat low in a bowl of pines, with crooked streets and a general store that kept the ledger of the town's small mercies and petty cruelties. Wind rolled down from Timberwolf Peak like an old man's sigh, and people carried that weather in their faces, worn, suspicious, patient with hardness. Sarah Whitlock kept the store's ledger with a careful hand and a quieter heart. She was 24, broad of shoulder from years of carrying sacks and stacking jars, her hair knotted at the nape in a practical twist she never fussed over. She moved through the mornings like someone who had rehearsed gentleness until it fit naturally into every gesture. The tilt of a pot to drain the last of the beans, the steadying of a child's cap as the wind caught it, the soft answer to a neighbor's complaint. Her hands were calloused, her voice was soft. When she smiled, rare, slow, it reached the corners of her eyes and made the freckled lines there look like maps of a life lived working for the simple good. The Whitlock name in town was like a score left scratched on an old piano, once familiar, now off-key. The land had given and then taken. Her father had gone down into a mine seam the year the spring flood swallowed half the footbridge. They told it like it was something that simply happened. People with hands to shake and coin to spend put their condolences into polite phrases and left. Then Loretta Whitlock had married Vernon, a man who drank to find courage and found instead an appetite for cruelty, and the tone of the house changed from grief to blame. Sarah did what she could to keep the stove lit and the shelves full. She answered to Loretta's sharp orders with a steadiness that guarded the last of her hope. But Loretta kept a ledger of grievances that outlived the man she resented. She resented what the mind had taken. She resented the town for watching and not doing more. And she resented Sarah, the quiet daughter whose ways made the house feel like a reminder of loss instead of a consolation. Where pity might have softened a mother, Loretta hardened. Little things accumulated. A dress deliberately pinned too tight, a meal withheld, a seam frayed at the hem. In Dusty Hollow, where neighbors watched and judged in equal measure, such acts were easy to hide and hard to forget. The general store itself was a narrow room of wooden shelves and sunlight that slanted through dusty windows. Miller's kept a kettle on the stove and a jar of tacks by the counter. There were notes in the ledger beside the names of townspeople, who owed flour, who had paid for a horse collar, who should be trusted with a key. Sarah kept a shelf for the forlorn, a place where people left things they thought no one else would want. Single gloves, a chipped bowl, a pair of children's wooden shoes mended one more time. She liked that shelf.
It told a story she believed in, that things could be useful again. The town's kindness, however, arrived in scant handfuls. It was in the way Mrs. Henderson, who ran the apothecary, would slide a salve jar across the counter without comment. It was in the way Reverend Mitchell paused at the store on Sunday to clear his throat and hand Sarah a hymn with a penciled note tucked inside, lines more like requests for courage than sermons. But such mercies were private. The square itself was public and unforgiving, particularly as summer leaned into the Harvest Festival that marked the town's calendar. The Harvest Festival was a time the Hollow showed its face. Flags of faded cloth were strung between posts. Children chased after roving geese. The smell of fried dough and wood smoke braided through every lane. The contest for best pie was for many the main event. A small stage, a few chairs, a jar of coins on a stump for the winner, and more importantly, the eyes of neighbors who weighed worth by the measurements of crust and filling. For some, the pie was merely pastry. For others, it was a stage upon which reputations were mended or marred. Sarah had baked for herself for years, bread that was always a little more dense, pies that were honest rather than showy. She baked because kneading eased a grief that had no name, because a warm bread brought a brief, practical miracle each morning. When Mrs. Henderson suggested she enter the festival, it was more an attempt at coaxing than an expectation. "You make a fine pastry, child," she said, pressing a cloth to Sarah's hands. "Let others see what I see in you." Loretta's mouth thinned at that suggestion. She had other plans. What she could not keep hidden in the house, she could hide in a seam or a stitch. She told Vernon it was time Sarah learned she was no one's prize. He grinned, and the grin looked like a learned cruelty. Clyde Dawson, the tide of mockery in human form, circled the square with the ease of a man who had learned to read a town's jokes and sell them. He noticed everything and liked nothing more than to buy a laugh. There was a man on the edge of that square who noticed as well, but noticed differently. Jeremiah Cole kept to Timberwolf Ridge. He lived in a cabin with a lean-to of wood and patience. The mountain had invited him to solitude, and he had accepted in the wake of a loss that had folded him inward. He was not a hermit in the sense of refusing human company. Rather, he had a grief that required space. Space for the memory of Mary's laugh, the small wooden toy Thomas had once carried, and the quilt Mary had stitched with a pattern of pines. Jeremiah wore his mourning in careful ways. A chair at his heart kept warm for a wife no longer there, a carved notch on the mantel for his son. Dust from the ridge layered his boots. His hands were strong from felling a tree or carving a spoon, and they kept love in the way a man who is known to lose keeps better than most.
He watched Sarah from the trees at first, not in any voyeuristic way. He saw her as one sees a light in the valley from a ridge, small, steady, a proof against the deep. He noticed the way she straightened jars at the store, the soft way she spoke with children, the way she bent to sweep storm's debris from the stoop. When he found spare jars of honey or a loaf of rye, he would leave them on the store's back step with no heraldry, tucked beneath an old stone so the wind would not steal them. He wrapped cakes in red cloth and left them where Sarah would find them in the morning before the town had woken. She thought them acts of kindness from someone who cared for the practical good. She did not know who left them, and so she gave a private, grateful blessing for the stranger whose footfalls did not answer. There are small decisions that become a life. Sarah folding the red cloth back was one. Jeremiah watching her fold it was another. Each time he left a honey cake, his grief receded a little, replaced by a simpler comfort, to watch someone be sustained. Each time she found the cakes and quietly placed an extra jar of jam into the forlorn shelf, her heart learned to trust small generosity again. Neither named the other at first. They exchanged kindness by proxy, he with bread, she with steadiness. A town like Dusty Hollow keeps a long view on people. It stores memory and then serves it out at the most public moments. So the festival came with a notice like a tide, and Loretta, who had sewn a scene with a thumb so practiced in cruelty it did not look like a crime in her own eyes, slid her little work within a dress Sarah would wear because she preferred a modest calico. The dress was blue with faded flowers, hemmed to just below the knee, a dress that had seen good hands and worse. Loretta's needle had been sharp with resentment lately, and she had made a fault in the seam that would not show until the strain of a dance or a step onto a stage. On the morning of the festival, the square looked like an open palm. People who had nothing in common but the weather and the rumor of it crowded the tables. Stalls sold boiled sweets in jars. Boys carried apple pies on their heads as if balancing a future. Sarah stood behind a table with her pie nestled in the center, workmanlike, not ornate, a pie that smelled of butter and a fruit that tasted like late sun. She felt the press of eyes, but also the strange buoyancy of being part of something bigger than herself. Clyde Dawson moved through the crowd like smoke. He had the habit of making private cruelties public for sport. For him, the town's laughter was a resource he could harvest. He was quick with a jest and quicker with the tilt toward anyone he could make smaller. When Loretta nods to him with the way one might give a dog a command, he takes it as an invitation. The stage was a planked platform under a frame of pine branches. Reverend Mitchell stood to one side with his hat in hand, attempting by habit to lend a note of solemnity to whatever was about to become a spectacle. The mayor, a man who loved his coin jar more than his title, shuffled papers that had no meaning beside the smell of fried dough. People came to watch pies and stay for everything else. The seam in Sarah's dress held until she walked onto the stage. She moved slow. There was a deliberateness to her steps, as if she were giving herself time to arrive. The light caught the blue calico and made it look like a small flag against a field of browns. Conversation folded around her for a moment and then narrowed. She set her pie down, the crust brown and honest, and she stood to smile at the crowd. For a few brief breaths, something like approval touched her face. The applause was polite. It felt to Sarah like a permission she had not expected. Then the seam gave. There was a sound like a snapped twig, and then fabric freed itself. The back of her dress opened under the pressure of the stage lights, and the quiet that followed was a physical thing. For an instant no one moved. Then laughter began, not at the pies, but at the woman whose clothes had betrayed her. A child's voice rose, and it had the cruel awareness of something imitated. Hands pointed. Loretta's mouth opened and closed like a trap, pleased. Sarah's heart hammered like a trapped bird. The world contracted around the moment. The seam, the tears, the cold whisper of fabric falling away from containment. She felt embarrassed in a way that was not merely physical. She felt the town's gaze strip clean the private parts of her history, her father's grave, the unpaid bills, the nights of listening to Loretta's bitter temper.
She felt the ledger in people's heads open and tally another charge against her worth. Clyde laughed loud enough to make people look at him. The laughter itself was a small weapon, and it found easy purchase. A few joined in out of reflex, others because it was easier to write a joke than feel for the one who had been injured. Somewhere someone clapped a hand over a mouth, then removed it and tried to smile at nothing. It takes only one person to change the tenor of a crowd. Jeremiah Cole's boots were heavy on the dirt as he stepped into the square. He had been moving through the pines with a bundle of cedar for a shelf when he heard the sudden noise, laughter like snapping branches. He saw Sarah on the stage the way a man sees a fire unexpectedly leap. He could not tell what started it, but he knew the hazard of its heat. The cores of men's gestures toward cruelty look alike from all distances, and he walked the distance between solitude and a public wrong with the same surety he had once used to carry his son on his shoulder. He did not run. He did not storm. He folded his coat about him like he had folded so many other small mercies in years of living alone.
He was older than most husbands in the hollow, his hair silvered at the temple, hands furred with work, but his gait had an unhurried steadiness that made space for speech to be sharp when needed and gentle when possible. He climbed the steps and reached out without asking, placing the coat over Sarah's shoulders. The fabric smelled like pine smoke and the sharp tang of river. It was big enough to drape like a small shelter. Silence fell like a hand. Some laughed, some cursed under their breath, but most of the sound in that moment was the slow intake of breath from a town that had been startled into noticing its shame. Jeremiah's voice, when he used it, was low and clear, like river stones set into place. "You will not stand alone to be taken apart by others," he said. There was nothing theatrical in it. There was no flourish, just the facts of a man who would speak in defense of a woman who had been made small. He looked at people as if he could make them feel their own choice. A few of them shifted under the weight of being seen. Clyde's grin faltered. The circle of laughter that had gathered around him slowed and thinned. Cliffed with a brightness, Reverend Mitchell cleared his throat and took off his hat. Mrs. Henderson's hand found her apron as if to secure it. Loretta's face was a tight thing, furious at the interruption. Vernon mumbled and pushed himself into the crowd for an advantage he did not have. The coat on Sarah's shoulders was an immediate comfort. It enclosed her in warmth and the steady scent of wood smoke. It also changed the scene's geometry. Suddenly no longer alone, she felt the town's gaze redirected. Instead of a woman stripped of dignity, there was a man who had chosen to shield her. People did not like seeing their jokes curdle into something that felt like accountability. Jeremiah spoke again, his words simple. He did not call out Loretta by name. He did not strip Clyde of his bravado with an insult. He stated, in a way that carried the weight of someone who had borne loss and learned its care, that cruelty will be recorded in the ledger of a town. His voice made a clear space for shame to settle where it belonged, on the behavior, not on the woman. Sarah sat down on the stage steps because her knees had turned to water, and she let the coat drape over her shoulders. She did not ask for his protection. She accepted it. There is a steadiness to agency that looks like accepting help when help is offered honestly. She did not melt into the coat like a child into a blanket. She kept her chin lifted as much as she could and let the warmth move through her like a promise not yet named. When the festival resumed, it did so in an altered key. People moved as if they had been reminded that certain things could not be done openly without someone taking note. The man shuffled and cleared his throat as if to restore the order of the day.
Reverend Mitchell found a hymn to sing that called for charity and mercy. The irony of the timing was not lost on anyone, and yet even the irony felt like a step toward humility. Afterward, the square emptied with the same slow inevitability as the tide. The jokes that had seemed so clever in the moment folded back into private pockets. Sarah climbed down from the stage with Jeremiah's coat loose about her. The fabric was warm and smelled faintly of cedar. When he walked her to the edge of the square, he did not speak much. People who have learned to see grief know the shape of silence and how it can carry more than words. "You did not have to," Sarah said finally, 2 steps from the store. Her voice was steady. There was a steadiness in her that had been built of necessity. "I saw what I saw," Jeremiah answered. He did not offer an explanation. He did not need to. What he offered instead was a look that held no pity and no calculation, only recognition. He had the look of a man who had loved and lost, and had decided that part of love was to stand against small cruelties. Loretta watched from the stoop of the house like someone assessing whether a loose board could be repaired without exposing rot. Her face was a mask of offended propriety. Vernon, who had been drinking since dawn, needed no prompting to show his contempt. He spat a word that could not be counted among civility and lurched away, pulling at Loretta's sleeve as if to lead her back into the house and away from witnesses. Clyde lingered on the periphery, his grin smaller now, his jokes like scraps that had lost flavor. He would return to the square with new stories, and some would find him funny again. But in that moment, his laughter had been swallowed by an act he had not expected, someone stepping into the current and drawing the attention of the town toward a moral choice. It takes a moment to change a town's pulse, but it takes that moment to begin. That night, Sarah placed Jeremiah's coat on the peg behind the counter as if it were a holy thing. She did not move anything in it, did not try to test for holes. She stood for a time with her hand on the wool and thought of the way the coat had felt like a small harbor. She was careful with her body in new ways. She kept remembering the stage and the sudden quiet. She did not, even at home, cry. She folded herself around tasks, because that was how she had learned to hold grief and to keep it contained enough for the day to breathe. Word traveled, as it always does in the hollow. Mrs. Henderson mentioned the coat in the apothecary when she handed over a salve, and she said it as if she were tucking a secret into a pocket. "He's a quiet sort," she told Sarah. "He's been good to folk these past seasons. Leave a knot on the ledger where gratitude belongs." But the ledger of the town kept other notes.
At home, Loretta unpicked a seam in the hem of the dress Sarah had worn that day, not to mend, but to see how she might better their separation. "You're an embarrassment," she told Sarah later, shutting the door on any attempt at reconciliation. "You let people pity you like it's charity." Her words were sharp. She said them as if they were instructions to be obeyed. Sarah answered without fight. Her fight had been used up on learning to survive, and the silence between them became another seam Loretta stitched. That same week, a honey cake wrapped in red cloth lay on the counter next to the ledger. Sarah found it at dusk with no note attached and a faint smear of ash on the cloth. She looked at it as if at a small signal. In the margin of her day, gestures like those moved like constellations, small and constant, pointing toward a pattern. She set the cake aside, washed her hands, and cut a slice. It tasted like sugar and something steady. She sat at the back of the store and ate it slowly, like eating a small truth. Jeremiah observed from a distance for several days after the festival. He came into town the way an animal returns to the ford, stopping at the edge of a life and testing it with the toe of a boot. When he finally entered Miller's General, the bell over the door gave a small ring as if in welcome and whisper. He carried a small parcel of cedar shavings tied with a leather thong and the smell of the mountain in his hands. He cleared his throat in the way of a man trying not to surprise a fragile habit. "You like the cakes?" he asked, setting the parcel on the counter. He did not assume familiarity. He offered a question like a bridge. "They're from you," Sarah said. She put the slice of cake down and met his eyes. She was not one to waste words on guessing games. He shrugged, a movement that folded the ridge of his shoulder like a map under pressure. "Thought you might need one. Recipes on the ridge are sparse. I learned to make more than a spoon for myself." There was something unpunished in his speech, an admission of need that did not beg. It was a way of saying he had given because he could, not because he expected a return. Sarah took in the way his hands moved, steady and careful with the cedar, and thought of what it meant for a man to carry grief and still offer his hands. "You have a shop a long way from here," she said. "I have a house a long way from here." He smiled without humor. It was the smile of a man who remembered a child's laugh and found it in the echo of his own. "My wife, Mary, used to line up jars on the window like someone who loved small things. Thomas used to steal the tarts when she wasn't looking. He stopped, letting the rest remain in the air. Sarah listened. She had known loneliness long enough to recognize it in another person. To speak of what had been lost was not to wallow. It was to clear room for something to stand. "I lost my father," she said. "He was taken by the mine."
And then, things at home got harder. She did not lay bare everything. She guarded what was private, but she gave him the truth sufficient for him to see her. "You deserve better than how folks treated you today," he said simply. He did not say it in a way that claimed to fix things. It was a statement of what ought to be, not of what he could instantly make true. She looked at him and felt something like recognition settle. He was an older man who had stepped into her shame without making a show of it, and she was a woman used to being small. There are moments when the ledger in a life flips from debit to credit, not by a grand deed, but by a small, consistent one. The leaving of honey cakes on chilly mornings, the draping of a coat over a trembling shoulder. These acts do not erase the past, but they make a place for a different future. They began in their slow way to talk more. Jeremiah came into the store on errands that might be real, sacked grain, salted fish,
or might be excuses to see her for a few minutes and share a story about the mountain. He told her about Mary's habit of mending socks with a tenderness he could not fully explain. He told of Thomas's small hands, the way they had once held a carved wooden soldier, and then dropped it into the creek as a laugh. When he spoke, he put names into the room that made the absences feel less monstrous, and more part of a story one could tell. Sarah told him of the ways a town's pity could weigh like a stone in the pocket. She spoke of the ledger that lists what people owe and what they owe each other, how sometimes the town forgets its debts. She told him of Loretta's sharpened tongue, of Vernon's loudness, of how it felt to be something another person wanted to discard quietly, like a book with its pages torn, tossed between carts and left for the weather. The town watched, as towns do when romance is not the point, but something more ambiguous, mutual rescue. Some whispered that Sarah was being led away by the mountain's call. Others said a man of Jeremiah's age couldn't be trusted with a young woman's future. They made charts out of rumors, which is how gossip pretends to be a map. But the friendship formed in that slow space was not built of gossip. It was built in the quiet work of two people who knew what it meant to be undone, and decided, with practical gestures, to be mended. Jeremiah left honey cakes, and Sarah left a jar of jam on the forlorn shelf he passed when he came into town. Small reciprocities that read like vows. Between them there began to grow the sense of a life that could be lived differently. He showed her a carved spoon he'd made from yellow pine, the grain like waves beneath his hand. She laughed when he admitted he had once painted the child's wooden soldier with bad courage, red on the wrong cheek, a soldier who looked perpetually surprised. They traded memories like people trading tools, honest and useful instead of decorative.
Yet under the warmth of those new glances was a ledger that the town had not closed. Loretta's intent did not vanish because the coat had been draped. Vernon's mood still swung like a poorly hung gate. Clyde still found jokes to tell, but he now looked for openings rather than assuming their readiness. For every neighbor who softened, a Mrs. Henderson giving a nod, Reverend Mitchell asking permission to visit and pray, there was another who chose indifference or worse. On a morning when the wind came down from Timberwolf Peak with a taste of snow, Sarah found a note tucked beneath the jar of flour, a brief line in a hand that was steady but not neat. It read simply, "When you can, come by the ridge. There is a shelf to be had for someone who likes small things." There was no signature. The invitation looked like an answering of a prayer she had not voiced and could not name. She considered it a long time before answering. There is an awkwardness to crossing thresholds that are not wholly yours, but curiosity and a hunger for something that did not feel like survival nudged her. When she accepted, she did so with the sense that she was choosing, not fleeing. That was crucial. Her agency remained intact. No one rescued her from living as much as she rescued herself by stepping toward an offer. The climb to Timberwolf Ridge was not easy for someone used to the town's flatter ground. Sarah moved carefully over roots and stone, her skirt catching on bramble, her breath taken in shallow pools. Jeremiah met her at the small gate with his broad hands ready to steady her if the path threatened. The cabin smelled like cedar and apple tar, and something softer still, the faint cut of time spent making a home. Inside, there were quilts folded in a corner, the stitches dense with memory. A small wooden soldier sat on a mantel, half-painted and perfect in its imperfection. For the first time since the mine had claimed his family's laughter, Jeremiah left a chair empty that was no longer an ache. They sat and boiled tea. They spoke of small things until they slipped into bigger ones. He told her of Mary's laugh again. She told him again of her father's hands. The conversation ran in the manner of two people building scaffolding for what might one day become a house. Not everyone in Dusty Hollow saw this with grace. On the way down the ridge, they passed a boy who knew the pleasures of repeating gossip and had not yet learned compassion. He stopped them with a question thrown like a stone. "Is that your bride?" he asked, thinking himself funny. "No," Jeremiah replied, his voice as even as the path. There was something about answering as if the question bore no power. The boy tossed the stone of curiosity aside and left them. As they approached the town, Sarah could see her reflection in the general store's window and thought of the coat folded on the peg behind the counter.
That garment had been the first public proof that someone could stand for her when others would not. She did not, in those moments, imagine a future written out in letters. She imagined small, durable things. A spoon carved with a father's name, a patch on a sleeve to mend a tear, a child's laugh beginning again somewhere else. But choices like those unsettle others. Loretta's house had felt colder in the days after the festival. Vernon had a new edge to his drinking. He would say things that left knives in the air. Yet in quiet moments, he also seemed aware that public shame had recoiled in the town's conscience. Some of that consciousness was merely self-protective. Better to avoid the man with the coat who could make a town feel ashamed than to become the subject of his quiet rebuke. Even as warmth began to circulate in Sarah's life, the ledger kept adding lines. The kindness she received cost her nothing in comfort, but it cost others the illusion that cruelty would go unnoticed. The moral economy of Dusty Hollow altered imperceptibly. A neighbor would hesitate before throwing out a cutting remark. A child might reach to help a woman crouching to tie her shoe. One evening, as the ridge bled amber into the valley, Jeremiah walked Sarah back to the gate. She turned and looked at the town lying low among the pines. Its roofs were dusky, smoke curled from a dozen chimneys. She felt, without fully understanding how, like someone who had been lost and had now found a path back to the center of herself. "You don't have to wear the coat always," Jeremiah said quietly. He did not say it to take the coat back. He said it like a man reminding someone that a shelter is a tool, not a prison. "I won't forget how it felt," Sarah replied. Her voice had a steadiness now, shaped not by endurance alone, but by the knowledge that someone else had seen her and chosen to act. He lifted his hand as if to touch the place where the seam of her dress had held and then torn, but he stopped himself and let his palm rest at his side. There was tact in that restraint. He knew the exact line between protection and possession. Respect, after all, is not merely the absence of injury, but the presence of choice. They parted under the diminishing light, and Sarah walked home with the coat folded over her arm, a small weight of warmth against the coming cold. She found Loretta at the door, waiting like an accusation in plain clothes. "You're late?" Loretta said. Her voice was thin with something like a calculation. "You could have been there," answered Sarah, not with anger, but with the quiet hurt that was more honest. There were times when mercy is not a moral lecture, but a simple register. Sometimes standing in truth means saying the plain thing. Loretta's reply was a low hum of displeasure. "We do not go about making a spectacle," she said. "People see things and they remember. You'll be a burden in other hands."
"I can make my own hands," Sarah said, and the sentence had the weight of a vow rather than a plea. It was not an act of shouting, it was an act of settling a line. She would not be a burden to someone who recognized her as a person first. The house swallowed her words into its usual cold. Vernon blinked at the table and looked away. He had nothing to say but a clumsy shrug. It was not the sort of victory that changed a life at once. It was the sort that starts the small work of reclaiming dignity. That night, Sarah took the coat from the peg and draped it over the back of a chair, as if laying a hand on a new promise. She fed the kettle and listened to the wind knock against the house. There was a sense, faint but true, that a new chapter had begun, one whose covers had not yet been written. The moment between the stage and the ridge had passed, and a new story was taking shape, one that would require bravery, not just from the man whose coat it had been, but from the woman who had the right to accept or refuse the offer of shelter. Outside, Timberwolf Peak cut its dark line against a sky freckled with distant stars. The pines whispered as if speaking of things older than town and ledger. Somewhere in the valley a dog barked and then ceased. In the absence that followed, a kind of possibility lay folded like a map. There were paths neither of them had walked before, and to look upon them was both a fear and a relief. If this story has reached a corner of your heart, if you felt that small, unexpected lift when someone stepped into a wrong and made it right, stay with this tale. There are seasons yet to come, wounds that will need time to mend, reckonings that will ask for courage, and a slow opening where a town learns a harder kindness. Subscribe to hear the rest of how two people remade what it means to belong in a place that almost learned to forget. Days slid forward like turned pages. The coat remained in the store, and the honey cakes continued to appear wrapped in red cloth. The town's talk leaned from mockery to curiosity, then to a quieter thing, remorse in some, defense in others. Sarah began to take small walks beyond the business of her daily chores, visiting Mrs. Henderson, arranging seed packets, listening to the way Reverend Mitchell read from Scripture, in a voice that felt less like a sermon and more like a summons to be better. Jeremiah continued to come and go. Sometimes his visits were long, the kind that stretched into stories told beside the stove. Sometimes they were brief, a nod, a parcel, a quiet word, as if they were rehearsing a set of small loyalties. Mary's quilt remained folded in a corner of his cabin. He brought out a patch once and showed Sarah the tiny stitches Mary had sewn in a corner, each one a prayer in thread.
He told Sarah about naming Thomas Jeremiah on a day the sun came through a crack in the clouds, about how the name felt like a promise made and kept.
As their friendship settled, Sarah's place in the town shifted like sediment after a storm. It was not that every person turned with sudden affection. Change in a town is slow as sap rising. It creeps and hardens and sometimes runs backward before it learns a steadier course. For every neighbor who began to hesitate before a cruel word, there were others who kept their distance because distance was easier than taking a side. But something had shifted. A small ledger line had been rewritten, and that had consequences. Winter pressed its first cold into the hollow. Snow came a week early, frosting the pines and muting the town's edges. Sarah kept the store as she always had, hands busy with jars and ledger entries. Jeremiah found excuses to come down from the ridge with bundles of cedar and tails of mountain foxes. The honey cakes continued to appear on the back step, sometimes warm, sometimes cool, always wrapped in that red cloth. Sarah saved one slice for a child who came to trade a wooden toy. She tucked the rest into her apron for a night when the house's stove would go hungry. Clyde Dawson did not forget the way his laughter had been hushed that autumn. Pride roots itself wide, and his had been watered for years by a town that let him shape the narrative. He collected allies among young men looking for a demonstration of hardness, and among those who mistrusted any change that asked them to account for a moment's cruelty. He began to mutter at the corners of the general store, and his mutters gathered into things meant to unsettle. Threats are not always shouted. Sometimes they are meant to be a reminder that the old ledger could be balanced the old way. One evening, on a road that cut across the creek and up toward Thornbridge, the narrow wooden span that connected the low street to a shortcut over the water, Sarah walked alone. She had been to Mrs. Henderson's to trade a jar of salve and had stayed too long listening to a story about an herb that would steady nerves. The light had left the sky in a gray ribbon when she shouldered her shawl and turned for home. Timberwolf Peak lay like a dark promise beyond the pines. The bridge creaked underfoot, a sound that made her think of old bones. Her breath made small moons in the air. The river beneath ran quick and black, its surface stitched with ice. The path cut by the bridge was convenient and quicker than the long way by the square. She meant only to keep her errands short, to keep the house warm, but people like Clyde chose these small routes for larger reasons. They stepped out of the pine shadow in a loose knot, 3 or 4, faces set in the kind of hard line that had nothing to do with the cold. Their laughter when they saw her was workmanlike, planned. Clyde's mouth made a slow curve as he stopped in the middle of the bridge and lifted his chin. "Going somewhere alone, Sarah?" he said, making the name a small thing. A man's laugh is an echo in a hollow. It bounces off the trees and makes the moment worse. Sarah huddled tighter into her shawl and kept her hands at her side. There was a memory of the stage, the seam giving. She felt again the heavy, falling quiet. Her instinct was to make herself small, to take the least space. Part of her had been taught to shrink. "You don't have to answer," Jerome, one of the other boys, said, as if daring her to rise to the bait. They wanted a scene. They wanted sport. Sarah did not look for a way to fight. She started to step around them, toward the far end of the bridge and the home that waited like a light. But one of them spread an arm. The wood underfoot strained with the weight of more voices than planks were meant to hold. "You've been cozy with the mountain man," Clyde said, voice low. "Don't think we like changes." One of the men moved closer. The gesture was meant to intimidate. The air tightened. For a moment, someone might have called a warning from the town. The hollow was not wholly empty. But the road was thin, the night a coat that muffled sound, and most people whose windows were light felt no authority to step into scenes that promised trouble. Sarah's breath came even and deliberate. She could not call for help. His was not the kind of rescue she wanted to rely upon, but she would not be taken without a line of defense. She had spent years carrying sacks and mending fences. She knew how to plant her feet when necessary. The first blow came fast, a shove meant to tilt her balance and to make the bridge itself complicit in her humiliation. She braced and did not fall. When Jeremiah reached for her, Jeremiah arrived as if pulled by gravity. He had been watching the town from the high trees, worried by a town's small weather, and his path down to the road had been the one of least resistance.
He stepped onto the bridge with the calm of someone who had never intended to cause more shame, but had always intended to stop it. "What's this?" he asked, folding himself into the space between Sarah and the men. Clyde spat something under his breath and stepped forward. In the struggle, Jeremiah did not try to shame them with words. He used his body to shield. A blow landed to his shoulder, an ugly, blunt strike that made him bend at the waist. He stumbled back, and his foot found no sure hold at the bridge's rail. For a second, the world narrowed to the scent of pine and the taste of ire in the air. They had meant to scare. They had meant rough hands and a quick lesson. In the crookedness of their plan, they had not counted on the way a woman who had known hard labor fights, economically with the leverage of weight and a steady aim of hands used to the heft of a sack. When Jeremiah felt himself tipping, it was Sarah who anchored him, not the other way around. She threw both arms around him and hauled with the kind of movement that had kept her upright through years of work.
Her knees flexed, her whole body braced, and she pulled him back onto the wood like she might have pulled a load from a cart. The men cursed and lunged. One grabbed at Jeremiah's coat. In the scuffle, a knife glinted, more threat than tool, and the world made the sound of breaking. Jeremiah took the blade's arc with his arm. His forearm received a cut that found flesh and bled. He did not cry out in a way that made the night gentler. He made a sound that was a raw animal thing, and then steadied. Sarah's hands were on him, warm, a counterweight to the sharpness. She pinned an arm behind one of the attackers with a grasp that surprised even him. She had the leverage of someone used to lifting heavy things and not flinching. The men, seeing the sudden seriousness of what had been a joke, chose retreat. Pride yields to risk. The bridge was a place where cowardice could hide in the dark. They spat their threats and left with a back that would bruise from the winter cold. The knife clattered into the creek and went silent. Jeremiah sank to his knees with the night swallowing his breath. The cut on his arm was not small. The blood feathered into the snow-black wood. Sarah crouched beside him, hands steady and certain. She tore a strip from her shawl and bound the wound as best she could, knots pressed with fingers that did not tremble. The hurt in his face was more than a cut. It was surprise. Surprise at being met with strength where he had expected fragility. "You're bleeding," she said, voice simple, pulling the shawl snug. "So are you," he answered, though the blood on her knuckles came from his arm and not from a wound of her own. There was iron on his breath, not from whiskey, but from the cut itself. "I'm all right," she said. "Stand, we'll walk." She helped him up the last steps off the bridge. They left the creek to its dark rush and moved toward the town where lamps burned like small confessions. News ran ahead of them. When they reached the store, Reverend Mitchell and Mrs. Henderson waited at the door with wraps and a kettle already heating on the stove. They had seen the lights and the long shapes of two figures walking. They had come because some things in a town still moved with a conscience. Mrs. Henderson took Jeremiah's arm with the dignity of someone who had delivered both babies and small truth. The wound was stitched that night by hands that had steadied it before with salve and prayer. No miraculous seam, only skill and attention. Jeremiah received stitches and a bandage. Sarah received words of thanks and an apron that smelled of herbs. The bridge incident changed something fragile inside both of them. He had stood for her and she had stood for him. The ledger between them no longer read in single columns of giving and taking. It folded into an account where both had claimed to be keepers. In the days that followed, the town's talk swelled and then found a new rhythm. Some spoke of courage, some whispered of recklessness.
Clyde dropped into a long, sullen silence for a time. Loretta, who had never known what to do with shame that belonged to her, watched the news of the wound and stitched herself tighter into the house's shell. There was no sudden contrition from her, only a new caution. Her abandonment would not be undone by one night of reckoning. Jeremiah's wound mended in the way of real injuries, slowly, with patience, with the kind of quiet work that teaches the skin to remember. Sarah tended his stitches and his moods. When he moved at night, she would sit awake and listen to him make small sounds, and the sounds taught her how much loss had resided in him. He in turn learned to let a hand rest where hers had steadied him. They traded rescue and repair until it became their habit. Spring edged toward the town again with a patience like prayer. Neither of them spoke at first of marriage. There are vows that begin without ring or altar, vows of care that are lived in the sharing of bread and the keeping of a wound covered until the skin knits. But community asks for a naming sometimes, and people feel a new order in names. Reverend Mitchell, who had seen many lives bend and come to peace, approached them one evening with a small, deliberate question. "Have you thought of how you'd like to affirm what you have?" he asked, eyes kind and searching. They looked at each other. Jeremiah felt the weight of his years and the tenderness he had found in the valley. Sarah felt the rights of adulthood. She had chosen. She had not been chosen into a life without her say. They spoke then,
with the simple, precise talk of people who had learned to measure meaning by acts rather than rumor. They chose a small ceremony, a promise not to perform but to settle into life together. Preparation for the wedding was a modest thing. Mrs. Henderson baked a cake, simple, with lemon and a sugar glaze. The townspeople who wished to come brought a pie or a jar of preserves, and the awkward gift of their softened faces. Jeremiah made rings from a strip of silver that had once been the winding stem of his mother's old pocket watch. He hammered the metal and smoothed it with the same patience he used on spoons. He used a pine needle to stamp a single mark on each band, a tiny pine impression that would link the rings to Timberwolf Peak. He wrapped them in a scrap of Mary's quilt so that memory and future would fold into the promise. Lamada did not come. She watched the day from behind curtains and told herself it was more prudent to remain at home. Vernon drank and told anyone who would listen that the town had gone soft, a complaint that sounded smaller than it had a year before. Clyde lingered at the edge of things, looking for fault, and found himself in the end at the back of the crowd. There is a town's pressure that can change even the hard-hearted to curiosity. The ceremony was held in Miller's General. The store turned for a day into a small room of gathered people.
Reverend Mitchell said a few words about mercy and about how houses are made of hands, not only of timber. Mrs. Henderson wept quietly into her apron. Jeremiah and Sarah exchanged their bands. The pine stamp on the silver gleamed dull and true. Sarah placed her hand against his weathered one and felt the map of his work. When they said their vows, it was not a vow to fix every wrong, but to do the small things that made a life, keeping warm, keeping honest, keeping watch. There was no great declaration from the mountains that the union would end all sorrow. Jeremiah's grief did not vanish because he married. The name of Mary stayed with him in the quiet corners of his mind. Sarah's past did not unwrite itself, but something had been settled. Two people had chosen each other according to knowledge, not a fantasy, but a fact. Life after the ceremony was a patchwork of ordinary miracles. They moved into Jeremiah's cabin on the ridge, and Sarah learned how the mountain kept its own weather and how to store wood against a silence that could otherwise be too loud. She stitched a new patch into Mary's quilt and left a jar on the store's forlorn shelf in case someone else needed to be remembered. Jeremiah taught her how to carve a spoon and how to find the right knot for a shelf. She taught him how to set a proper pie crust and how to talk about loss without trying to mend it all at once. Neighbors who had only known rumor learned to know the human textures beneath. Mrs. Henderson brought over tinctures and a stew. Reverend Mitchell came for the occasional meal and left with a sermon that felt smaller and truer. Even Loretta, slow as an old weathered rock, eased her hard edges in ways that were small and reluctant. She mended a pair of Jeremiah's mittens with hands that had not known to do kindness for its own sake, and stood one day at the end of the rich path, watching the people who had once been a threat to her family. The admittance of error is a quiet thing. It does not annul hurt, but it softens the ledger line by line. Children began to play at the edge of Timberwolf Ridge, where before they had steered clear. Someone left a small wooden soldier at the store, half-painted and perfect in its imperfection. It belonged to no one and to everyone all at once. In the softness that followed, Sarah discovered she wanted to be part of a continuity she had once thought denied her. Not stolen by pity, not bought by obligation, but chosen. When she discovered she was with child, the news felt like a new map laid over the old one. The town did not form a single shape of reaction. Some felt joy as if they had been granted a share. Some felt anxiety about the future. Some felt nothing at all. For Sarah and Jeremiah, the child was a promise they had not uttered aloud, an answer to a call they had not known how to name. Labor came in a night of wind and the smell of pine smoke. Miss Henderson held Sarah's hand like she had held so many others in the small, private work of bringing someone into the world. Reverend Mitchell sat by the stove and hummed an old hymn without words. Jeremiah stood in the doorway, hands clenched as if he could stitch the world into order. The child entered the room with a single, sharp cry that placed him instantly in the present. They named him Thomas Jeremiah, a name that nodded to what had been lost and to what was being given, a bridge between grief and hope. The sound of the name was a stitch across the years. When Sarah first held the boy, wrapped small and fierce against her chest, she felt a kind of triumph that was not public at all, but sovereign and private. He smelled of powder and the plain sweetness of newborn hair. Jeremiah, unashamed of his tears, traced the contour of the infant's ear, as if relearning the geography of hope. The town came to meet the child,